Welcome to the American Compass podcast. My name is Oren Cass. I am the chief economist at American Compass, and we have yet another fantastic episode for you this week. It is CHIPS Week here at American Compass, the 2-year anniversary, give or take, of passage of the CHIPS and Science Act. And we thought it would be interesting to talk with Senator Todd Young, one of the leading conservative proponents of the bill, about how it's going, lessons learned, future pathways for industrial policy, things we could have done better this time around, and how it all fits into a broader outlook for conservative economics. So that is a terrific conversation coming to you. Also, got to tell you about what else is going on at American Compass this week. The Compass Point, also on the CHIPS Act, is from our very own policy director, Chris Griswold. He takes a look at what's been going on with the Intel announcement and what that means, how to assess the progress of the CHIPS rollout to date, and what the key legislative priorities should be for industrial policy in the future. Also on the Commons, we've got Mark DePlacido responding to Vivek Ramaswamy's speech at the National Conservatism Conference, Joel Thayer, president of the Digital Progress Institute, on the constitutionality of banning TikTok, and Brad Wilcox, author of Get Married, of course, a beloved Compass advisor and one of certainly conservatism's leading experts on family policy, talking about what the Vance VP selection might mean for family policy going forward. So a lot of interesting stuff for you to take a look at there. And of course, I cannot complete this intro without reminding you, you need to be subscribing to my Substack, Understanding America, with new thoughts every Monday and a big pile of links, well, including to everything I just told you about every Friday. So subscribe to that. And in the meantime, enjoy this conversation with Senator Todd Young. Senator Young, thank you so much for joining us.
It's great to be with you, Oren. Thanks for having me on.
You know, you've been a real leader on a lot of the economic thinking that's been going on in Congress, with certainly new focus on industrial policy, CHIPS Act, I think, as probably the leading example. But wanted to start by just stepping back a little bit and asking you about how your own thinking has evolved. I mean, you're a University of Chicago guy. Um, what has shaped how you think about the economic challenges we have in the country, and in particular, what your role as a policymaker might have to be in that?
Well, thanks for asking, Oren. There has certainly been an evolution in my thinking, as I would hope there would be an evolution in sort of every policymaker's thinking as the world changes around them. I still believe in certain foundational things as that for as long as I can remember were important to me. I believe in the elegance of markets, the importance of free markets. Believe that government should be, should exist within certain bounds. Limited government. There are limits to the sorts of activities our state should be involved in, and there are good reasons for that. Believe in the importance of rules, clearly delineated rules and norms around the capitalist system. And I think that, collectively, those sort of bundle of priorities are essential to freedom and prosperity. None of those things have changed, but I think it's important to recognize that markets, rules-based capitalism exist within a legal framework, within a policy framework. And when the rules are distorted, as they have been by some state capitalist counterparties, then we need to change our approach to dealing with those counterparties. And so that that recognition has informed some of the rethink I've done on policy making in recent years. Most especially, it's caused me to think about how we can make our supply chains more resilient at a time when they are overly dependent on the goodwill and cooperation of the Chinese Communist Party and other state capitalist countries who are weaponizing our economic interdependence for geopolitical reasons. And as I've begun to think more about that, it's clear to me that we also need to factor into our policy making sort of the lack of resiliency associated with natural events as well, from pandemics to earthquakes and beyond. I think if we followed the playbook that I did growing up, we'd leave it to individual market actors, whether they're businesses or just individual persons, to seek out comparative advantage and efficiency and return on investment without any regard for the broader implications of their own decisions on the economy. But you and I know, Oren, that sometimes the costs of individual decision making are internalized. They can have spillover effects onto a larger economy, and it's our job as policymakers to ensure that we address that dynamic through our playbook. And so, those are some ways in which my economic policy uh, making and thinking about uh, uh, policy making have changed. There are other things, eureka moments that stumbled across along the way. I've revisited our own economic history post World War II and come to appreciate just the essential nature of government investment in research and development, upstream investment in fundamental areas of research, but also some areas of applied research. The benefit to cost ratio of those investments have really been off the charts. So it got me thinking why we weren't doubling down on these sorts of investments. Instead, we were disinvesting in these areas in recent decades, and so I've made it a priority to ensure that we rebuild our national research enterprise so that we might all benefit from those breakthroughs as well.
And so this is, of course, exactly what the CHIPS Act focuses on. There's both the semiconductor element of it, and then the full thing is the Chips and Science Act, which also has a tremendous amount of investment in that science, basic research, applied research, infrastructure. I guess focusing on the chips side with the semiconductors, there's such that whole industry is such a quintessential example of all of the things you just talked about. There's a reason this is the law that went through. Um, I'm curious. There's a lot of interesting debate about what the actual reason for focusing on semiconductors is. And I think even, in what you said, if I were to add some of my own, I can think of at least four. One is the national security focus and the idea that, especially vis-a-vis China, we need to have control of critical technologies. One is the broader supply chain resilience focus.
Yes. Sometimes called economic security,
Yes,
right?
that's exactly right. And even in a world of pleasant, friendly actors, you would still have all sorts of reasons you wouldn't want all of the all of the cutting edge semiconductor work going on in Taiwan.
Yes.
There's more of a sort of technology and innovation argument that says, if you're not good at something like semiconductors, you're going to lose all of the engineering experience around that. You're going to lose the related expertise. Pretty soon, you're going to get worse at all sorts of stuff that matter. And then there's the sort of broader focus on manufacturing, the idea that these are sort of high quality jobs, that they can really be anchors for communities and so forth. In your mind, does one of those spike, or is it just a sort of all of the above? The nice thing is it all points the same way.
I emphasize the first two. Our job is to deal with slippery slopes in policy making, and so I oftentimes there's a slippery slope argument made against particular interventions that, in truth, make a lot of sense, right? Uh, but I volunteer to you and to others that I'm apprehensive about the latter argument, jobs, high tech manufacturing, job creation, and the misapplication of industrial policy or the over application, overuse of industrial policy interventions to create jobs. Though I think it's wiser to focus on the national security and economic security prongs. And then, if by extension, in advancing those prongs, you create jobs, celebrate that job creation, prepare people for those jobs, but don't. It was, we can create jobs by investing $39 billion in manufacturing. If you take the $39 billion investment and divide it by the number of jobs created by this whole effort, though, I'm not sure I would advance that proposition. So there's a much more important value proposition that is being advanced by the Chips and Science Act and could conceivably be advanced by other initiatives. I throw out critical minerals as an area that I'd certainly be open to, and perhaps some others. Um, the national security and economic security pieces are actually linked, sort of elegant. That is, if we reshore to the United States, the commodity chips, not the leading edge chips, which are essential to go into our ballistic missile systems and radar systems and so forth, the national security piece of it. But the commodity chips that go into toasters and so many other consumer electronics, the engineering required to build those commodity chips is roughly the same as the leading edge chip engineering. But you need scale that comes with selling a lot of chips, and that comes with the commodity chips, so that you have the ability, you have the expertise, and a whole set of workers who know how to make the national security oriented chips, and also drives down the cost of making the leading edge chips substantially. So you really have to, as I think Secretary Raimondo has accurately put it, you need to reconstitute much of the ecosystem here in the United States, de-risking supply chains, and then that gives you the capacity to manufacture trusted microelectronics for our warfighters. I think there's another piece to this that is really important, and oftentimes it's not mentioned, and that is the coordination of our manufacturing efforts with those who are located near the United States or those with whom we have very trusted relationships. So it's really important that the United States, through our diplomats, are coordinating production of key semiconductor components, Mexico with Japan and many others, that it accomplishes, various things. Number one, it's a recognition of the fact it would it's nearly impossible for us to become entirely independent of other countries for every piece of the semiconductor supply chain. It also recognizes the fact that it's probably not desirable. We have a high degree of trust in the ability of the Japanese to produce and share with the United States critical components. And I think collectively we all benefit, the Japanese, the United States, the Mexicans, from these relationships. Gives a duplication to our supply chains so that we're not reliant on one particular node. It reduces the cost because it does harness Ricardo's comparative advantage across countries. We circumscribe the countries that we're willing to partner with when it comes to some of these components. So I think the trade piece is the one that frankly, that the Biden administration has been missing. But I do think it's an essential part to effective implementation of industrial policy.
So, CHIPS Act passed almost exactly 2 years ago. The most of the actual commitments, at least, are now out the door. A lot of ground has been broken. Those who supported the CHIPS Act initially, by and large, celebrate everything they think is going right. Those who opposed it have a long list of everything they think is going wrong. Um, as as someone who supported it, but also I at least will attest to being a quite honest broker on such questions. What is your assessment? How is it going? What has surprised you about it? What are you optimistic about? Concerned about? Curious about your read on it.
Well, I think on balance, it's been a remarkable success so far. Knock on wood, right? Um, you just cannot quibble with the you know tens of billions of dollars committed so far. It was only $39 billion allocated for manufacturing incentives. We haven't hit that level. And we've seen roughly $450 billion of private capital unlocked. That by any stretch is absolutely remarkable. Um, our resiliency has increased to such a point that by 2030, it's estimated that United States will be producing 20% of the world's leading edge semiconductors. That's quite remarkable. That will supply a very significant uh, amount of the mission critical semiconductors, mission critical to our critical infrastructure, uh, uh, from server farms to our telecommunications equipment and uh, all the things our military needs. A very large portion of those semiconductors will be produced substantially in the United States of America, which is quite an accomplishment. Some of the friction points that have received attention have been childcare mandates, which, if you look at the legislation, never, there was nothing to mandate high quality childcare. There was an administrative decision in a tight labor market to declare uh, it to be a priority of the program, uh, to offer high quality childcare at various sites. In a tight labor market, these are good paying jobs. Childcare was already being offered. So this was a public relations misstep, and I think folks recognized that. I think it's, in general, an unfair criticism, although I would acknowledge that anytime this sort of chatter is circulating, that you're starting to see rules and conditions put on manufacturers that creates some business and is uh, a risk for the participants. There's been critiques about the use of organized labor to construct fabs. I'd respond in two ways. Aside from acknowledging that that is accurate, number one, in order to attract the quality of labor, again, in this tight labor market, these sorts of positions require uh, organized labor. They're an important part of the labor pool, and they would be building a lot of these fabs anyway. The second response is a political one. In order to get this through Congress at all, to say nothing of it in a timely fashion, we had to involve labor, and I'm glad we have. Um, the last argument is just the one that I think we're most familiar with, which is uh, this visceral concern about the United States adopting industrial policy and the precedent it might establish, as folks discuss, perhaps applying it to other areas. And for that one, I make no apologies. I think these things merit discussion, which is why I'm glad we're discussing them today. There's a reason we don't do tons of industrial policy in this country, aside from the ideological reservations many folks have. And that's because it's hard. It's
Mhm.
hard to do well. It's complicated. We're coordinating production. We're establishing, um, uh, you know, priorities that aren't dictated exclusively by the market. But our job as policymakers is to take the free market models that are put forward and um, try and exercise some discernment as we apply real those models to real world circumstances. We have to recognize when the models don't incorporate certain risks and externalities, and that's why we adopted industrial policy and this contingency of we were in the middle of a global pandemic, and there were real time shortages imposing massive costs on a daily basis on our economy, and the invisible hand was frozen. It was frozen. And this is the intervention that made the most sense in the circumstances. And I think on balance, it's really played out very well.
Yeah, I
But
think
we should learn from this, of course.
yes, yeah, I think your point about the precedent is exactly right, and as you said earlier, there's always the slippery slope concern, and so recognizing what the precedent does and does not apply to is in the legal context, that's of course the whole game. You you take the decision and then fight about what it you cabinet or extend it and so forth. Definitely want to.
I guess I'd turn the slippery slope concern on its head. I'm concerned about the slippery slope of doing nothing, assuming that supply and demand will always meet in a timely fashion, uh, and that will achieve the most socially and economically desirable result. Well, will in the vast majority of circumstances, but uh, it would not have in this circumstance, and so the slippery slope of doing nothing, assuming that our our best course as policymakers is in the midst of a crisis is to stand by and to reassure people the market will, in the end, in the long term work, is what most concern me.
Yeah, that's actually it's a very nice point that in a sense we are at the bottom of a slippery slope that started with support for free markets and opening up trade and so on and so forth, and we slid down it to the point of there's the famous quote from George H.W. Bush's chief economist: "Computer chips, potato chips, what's the difference?"
Right.
And so there we were almost sort of at the bottom of the slope, and in a sense what we're doing is trying to climb at least a little bit of the way back up it, maybe to a more comfortable perch. um
Yeah.
so want to talk a little bit about are there other places we should be doing this kind of thing? But first, just to pick up on your I think you did a nice job running down some of the criticisms that have been raised, whether it's on some of the mandates, the labor. I think another one that has come up is just environmental issues, where probably everybody agrees it would be nice to have permitting reform. It never actually happens. Um, I'm curious if you are there any of
So
those?
I will say,
Yeah.
most of those critiques are coming from the Republican side. Um, I, working with some other legislators, negotiated a permitting reform that would apply just to fabs, that would deal just with the semiconductor space. We were able to get it out of the Senate, but we couldn't get sufficient traction in the House because there was an insistence that the permitting reform initiative be expanded to other areas. And, I certainly support that sentiment, but it wasn't feasible at the time. So you should know that that is, and everyone should know that that's a priority of mine. But it's not something. It's not a challenge we created. In fact, administratively, uh, and overseeing this effort, we've been able to compress the NEPA timeline to get these fabs approved. To and so it's been somewhat expedited, but that is indeed a lingering challenge that I recognize, and everyone does. It's not an infirmity in the chips and science.
Yeah. And so is there, if we were to do more of this stuff, let's say in critical minerals or in general as policymakers think about other situations where this might arise, are there particular things you would want to see done differently than we're done with chips, whether that is put the permitting reform or exemption straight in as part of the bill, or have better language that tries to ensure you don't get mandates beyond the sort of specific purpose. Just as a matter of legislative drafting, even are there a couple of things you'd say, Here's how we can do this better"?
Well, I will say that we attempted to get permitting reform included
Hmm.
as part of this legislation. As much as I appreciate our union laborers and really salute them for their great work and participating in this program, I thought others should have participated as well. So that critique is also one that just doesn't hold water. So from a political standpoint, there were limitations on what we could get passed, and unfortunately, it took us a couple of years longer to get this legislation passed than I would have liked. In part because there was such insistence from um, some of my colleagues with whom I share most views on policy issues that we had to make this legislation perfect before it could be approved. But with all that said, I think the things you mentioned would optimize the policies moving forward if there is sufficient political support behind them. Of course, we need more. We need permitting reform to reduce the cost of construction, decrease the burden on taxpayers, and ensure that we get more bang for the buck. Of course, we need a freer market in labor for many of the same reasons. Um, I think if we can continue to build the constituency around very selective, very narrow interventions in our economy that require industrial policy, then if you get a broader political coalition, you have the leverage to get these sorts of concessions in the end. But we didn't have that leverage, which is why it's so important for us to talk about how this intervention, controversial at the time, has been very successful and is by extension quite popular.
Yeah. And so I guess
Yeah.
that's perfect segue to the last question I wanted to ask you, which is, looking ahead, I think there's one school of thought that says, well, let's see if there's another place we need to do this. Maybe it's critical minerals or something.
Hmm.
There's another school that looks at a couple things you've mentioned. One is how long it took to get this through the first time. The second is the basic point of just the actual capacity, learning how to do it, setting up the infrastructure for it is so challenging. And this is my view, full disclosure, that what we'd ideally have is a more sort of permanent financing authority of some sort that has clear boundaries around the kinds of things it can do, focused on those national security, economic security areas that you mentioned, but is set up more to be able then to take those on, whatever the specific supply chain or product might be. Do you have a does that approach appeal to you? Do you prefer to say, no, let's wait and see if we need to do it for critical minerals, or how would you want to see us go forward on this kind of stuff?
Oren, I would be open to your sort of more institutionalized approach, but I think the one thing that I'm missing before we give up some measure of implementing authority or to an administration, which is what I'm inferring
Yeah.
you're suggesting, um, is how you measure the cost on the American people, on society, on our economy, on our national security of failing to act. You know, this this decision about when to use industrial policy, um, as much as I've tried to come up with some principles, and I just defended them for our involvement, it's not formulaic.
Hmm.
It's sort of a multi-factor analysis, which requires, critical thinking, debate, reflection. But if someone can do a better job, and it could be a multi-factor sort of analysis, better job, which you're working on making these decisions more systematic, then I might be comfortable with that. But for now, I think we should handle these things on a case by case basis. Uh, I'm not looking for lots of opportunities to do this. I do think the free market is the best way to allocate resources, but we ought to be looking for areas in which there are uh, really costs that need to be addressed, and an insurance policy of sorts uh, can be implemented. So, critical minerals is the one that for me is most accessible and understandable to folks. But yeah, I think there's more enthusiasm, perhaps by you and certainly by some others, to apply this to other areas. What I would really caution folks against is implementing industrial policy with a primary objective from the outset being job creation. Key partners in implementing a national security and economic security oriented industrial policy will be located in uh, uh, areas in which manufacturing capacity exists, and I celebrate allowing more people to play a meaningful part in this dynamic economy we have across middle America, across the industrial Midwest that I represent, down in Arizona, places that aren't on the coast. But that should not be the leading objective. Otherwise, we're going to end up, I think, over applying this model.
Yeah. No, I would certainly agree with that. And we will leave it there. Thank you so
Yeah,
much for the time. Thank you for your leadership on this issue. Congratulations on what I agree is tremendous success so far. And perhaps in a couple years we will do the 4-year anniversary episode at a ribbon cutting of some sort.
that would be fantastic. Yeah. Well, thanks again for your scholarship and your thoughtfulness on this issue and many others. And thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. That will do it for this episode of the American Compass podcast. We will be back again next week. Until then, enjoy the summer.